Hi, my name's Craig. I'm the Technical Manager here at QNAP UK. Today I wanted to cover off our QHora-301W. So this is going to be a bit of a first-time setup, talk through some of the different functions and features that we have and how you can use the different ones, as well as just different configurations that are possible with the device. So this is our next generation Wi-Fi 6. It's a dual port 10 gig SD-WAN router. It doesn't just have two 10 gig ports though, there are some 1 gig ports on the back as well. So this is what the device looks like from the front. Very clean looking, no sticky up antennas on it like I see on a lot of the other devices that are out there. By default, port number 1 of the 1 gig interface is the WAN port, but the wizard will tell you that. Over here on the back we can see the two 10 gig ports, and we've got the 4-port 1 gig switch there as well. And there's a couple of USB ports so that you can connect things like storage, USB storage to those, so that you can access them like an FTP server if you want to. So I'll show that feature a bit later on as well. But that's the basic function of the device. Now, one piece of software I would highly recommend installing before setting up the device is our QNAP QFinder software. QFinder works for setting up some basic functions on our NAS as well as on the QHora and our managed switches. The reason I like this the most is because the default password of the QHora is the MAC address. So it's unique to every product, and it's written over here as the MAC address. So you've got to keep the case the same but remove the hyphens. So that's going to be the password for the device. It is also written on the bottom of the product, but I find it much easier to come here to find the password than flipping the product upside down. It's obviously a lot easier if you're using Wi-Fi to set this up and you're nowhere near the device. This is a much easier way to get that information. So first of all, you just click login and it will take you to the main login page, which is what I've got here. I'll just refresh it, make sure it's still there. There we go. So here I'm going to go through the installation guide, and this is exactly what you would see setting it up for the first time. Firstly, there's a bit of information about our QuWAN software, which is our SD-WAN function. This works in conjunction with our QuWAN Orchestrator website, so that you can set up multiple sites and have quite a wide topology. So if you're part of an organization and you've got lots and lots of different offices, maybe lots of remote workers, where the remote workers may have multiple devices in their work from home environment, like a VoIP phone, perhaps a printer, some things that all need to connect through a VPN connection back to head office. This is a really great way to do it without having to do individual VPNs on lots of devices, or perhaps having devices that don't even support VPN. Like a lot of printers wouldn't support VPN functions, but this would allow the printer to even be part of the large corporate network if you wished as well. So I'm going to just click OK on that bit of information. I'll show you a bit more about QuWAN later. The first question it's going to ask us is about the WAN settings. So it is telling us to connect to port 1 of the router with your modem before we continue any further, and you can choose whichever option that you need to for your ISP. For my specific one, it's PPPoE, so I'm just going to type in the connection details and get connected, and then we'll come back once we're all up and online there. So I'll just get this typed in and click next, and we'll wait for that to connect. Okay, that's all connected to the internet now. So now the next question is asking us about the wireless domain settings, so any regulations specific to your country for Wi-Fi. Some countries and regions allow different wireless channels to others. So I'm in the UK, so I'm going to select the United Kingdom there and click apply. It's asking me to make sure the device is on the latest firmware. It's already checked that, and I am on the latest firmware, so I'm just going to skip this step. If you ever did need to apply a manual update, at this point you can apply that manual update there. Sometimes that's handy if you didn't do the internet setup on the previous screen, so this will allow you to, if you already have the firmware downloaded, you can upload it here if you need to. Okay, so that's it all set up. So now we need to log into the device. So by default, the default username is admin, and the password is, as I mentioned earlier, it is the password which is matching the MAC address here. So you've got to type the case matching, so uppercase, but without those hyphens. So if I type that now, so 245EBE, and go back and check the rest, 4473F6. And I'm going to click login. So this is where it wants the username and password to be typed in. So the default username is admin, and the password is the same as the MAC address, the one that I showed you here. So that's the password. It's uppercase, and you've got to take all the hyphens out. So that would be the default password. And again, that is written on the base of the product as well, if you need to find that. So I'll just type mine in here and click login. There we go. So now what it wants you to do is to change your username and password to something that's different from the default. So I'm going to just use the same username, and I'm just going to use the nice secure password of QNAP and click OK. So it'll log us back out so that we can just verify those credentials. So if I just log in with those, click OK. Now we're logged in. So now we're logged in with our new credentials. We're no longer on the default password or username. If you did type a different username, we can see we've got a internet connection up and running, and it's monitoring the traffic that's happening on the connection live right now. Showing you the connection type, showing you the status of the virtual access point. So this is for the Wi-Fi connection. And it's also showing that I've got one client, which is right. I only have my laptop connected right now. So everything is good on the dashboard. So we've got a few options on the left to go through. QuWAN I'll come to later. I'll do that towards the end of the session, and I'll talk through the rest of the functions on the device. So the first one I'm going to go to is the client. So this is everybody connected through this device. So I'm connected with a wired connection right now. It's found my Craig MacBook Pro. And you can get a little bit of information, just things like MAC addresses, what IP. You can change the description here as well if you want to have a different name other than the one it detected. You can set that. And you've even got an option over here to block that client if you did not want that client to have any access to this device. If you do accidentally add somebody to the block list or want to remove somebody, there's a block list section here where you can unblock clients if you need to as well, if they're added to it. So we'll come down to the next section, which is the network section. So this gives you the overview of how the device is set up. So by default, as it said on the initial setup wizard, port number 1 of the 1 gig switch is the WAN port that's set up by default. So that's the one that I've got here. That's all the functions set up, and there are some settings that you can go into on the right. We'll cover those off in a minute when I add some other settings. So at the top here is how you configure the WAN port. So there might be a reason you didn't configure your internet settings in the wizard at the start, and that might be because you want to switch to using a 10 gig connection for the WAN instead, and this is where you'd set that up. So you've got options to use port 1 of the 1 gig switch. You can use the first 10 gig port instead, or you can use ports 1 and 2 of the 1 gig switch if you want to aggregate 2 separate ports together. So if I was to select that option, just gives you a little scenario over here of the usage. So you can aggregate 2 services together so that if one of them went down, the other one would take over, so there'd be no disruption to the connection. So there's a lot of different options you can set there. I'm not going to set that setting, I'm not going to apply it, so we'll leave it how it is. If we come down to the WAN option, you get a overview status. This is the same information that was on the front screen, so this will give you a live update of the traffic going through the router right now via the WAN port. You can click info and you get a bit more information about the connection if you ever needed it. As we go down to the LAN, we see how all the structure of the LAN ports are set up. So this is just an information screen. You can't change any settings here, but it's just telling you how it's currently laid out and what's connected where. Down into the VLAN section, there's a lot of functions in this VLAN section. It might not look it from looking at the screen straight away, but the top one there is the IP address of the device itself, so of the QHora. Now in here is where all the settings are for the whole network setup. So if I was to go in here, this is where the DHCP server's set, so it's allocating IP addresses 100 to 150 out so that automatic users can connect. You can change that if you need to. By default, there's no VLAN set on this, and you can add a description if you want something a bit easier to remember up there. And you can even do static IP reservations down here. So you can click add and say the device name, so let's say Craig-MVP, and you can type in a static IP address that this machine will always get allocated by the DHCP server here. So you can set that up if you need to. So I'm not going to change any of those settings, but that's where those settings are. They're under the VLAN ID, of the one that's just labeled dash. So that's how you would access things like the DHCP server. So I will add a VLAN just to illustrate how that works. So here, if I do a VLAN of 20, let's say, description is IoT devices maybe. So let's say that's IoT devices. And you can set up an IP address for this port. So I could do something like 10.10.10.1. You can choose the subnet mask. You can enable spanning tree if you wish. And for this VLAN, if you want to, you can have a set of IP addresses. So I'm going to say 10.10.10.100, and I'm going to say 10.10.10.200 will be my IP range. And for the DNS server for this group, I'm going to give them the IP address of the fixed IP address of this VLAN group as the DNS server. And again, just like before, you can set reserved IPs for anybody with a specific MAC address if you want them to always have the same IP. So we'll set that up and we'll click OK. So that's going to create a VLAN group of 20. And now I can go back up to some of the other settings and I can show you what you can do with the VLAN. So if we go back up to the different port definitions, we've got these setting options I mentioned earlier. So let's say I want port number 2 to be maybe wired to a separate switch that's got all my IoT devices on it. You can change it from access mode to trunk mode, and now you see the VLAN that you've added. So if I take that and I can give it a description and say this is my IoT devices and click OK. So now anybody connecting into the physical port number 2 of the 1 gig switch here, anybody who's connected into that is going to be part of the VLAN group 20, and they're going to get a different set of LAN IP addresses than everybody else on the network. So that's one way to do that. We do, oops, sorry, I have to click apply on that one. So once you've got that set up, we also have a VLAN pre-configured for a guest Wi-Fi network as well. So that's already down there. So anybody connecting off to the guest wireless network will be on that IP range. I am going to change that just now because a bit later on when I go to set up the QuWAN, if this is all set by default, it actually will conflict with another device that's on the network. And because everything is going to be becoming part of the same network via the QuWAN, it'll give me an error if I do that. So I'm just changing it to something that's not used for that. So I'm just going to set all that up so that it's something different. Click apply on that one. Okay, so we can see that that IP range has changed down here as well. So something else you can do with the VLANs is you can also use those in the virtual access points, but we'll cover that off in a minute. For the routing, we can see the different routing. So we've got the routing that's already been set up by some of our default connections. So the standard LAN already has one. For the VLANs that we've added for the WAN connection from the ISP. If you want to add any extra routes, you can add a static route yourself manually over here as well. But the default one should work for most people. But you can add custom ones if you need to. So we'll move into the next section, which is the wireless/virtual access point section. Now we have had a few questions of people saying, how do I enable Wi-Fi 6 and things like that, because there isn't a setting for it. There isn't a setting for it because it's always enabled. There's no need to do anything with it. It's always enabled. You can choose things whether or not your Wi-Fi 6 is working on both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz or just one or the other. You can change those things around, but Wi-Fi 6 itself is always on as standard. So out of the box, you will get a single virtual access point enabled. You can set up a total of 3 that you can do advanced settings with, but there is a guest wireless network that you can use as well. So that's off by default, but you can enable that if you need to as well. And you've got a default password there, so you can see what that is if you need to. And we do also have WPS, which is the Wi-Fi protected setup. There is a button on the back of the device so that you can push that. And you can push the corresponding button on the device you're trying to connect, and they'll be connected. So just to go through the settings of some of the different options. So if I look at the default one that's been created, we can go in and have a look at the settings. So this is where you would change the SSID for it. So if you wanted a VLAN on it, you can set that up there. Whether you want to hide the SSID so it's not broadcasting it, you can only connect if you type it in manually. We do support 802.11r, so if you want to use fast roaming between different access points, we support that. And you can also set a schedule on the Wi-Fi, so you can have it not broadcast at certain times. You can completely disable the interface at certain times if you wish as well. So there's a lot of functions you can do there. Now if you want to go into sort of the more advanced settings, like global settings that affect everything to do with the wireless bands, that's the advanced band settings button up here. So this is where you can enable things like band steering, so that's pushing people towards a less interfering band. So if you want to make sure that your users, if they're capable, are on the 5 GHz band with less interference and more speed, you can enable that as well. And you've got all the different functions for the different frequencies. And we support channels in the 5 GHz all the way up to the 160 MHz range as well. So if you want to effectively do a 4-wide connection, you can do that for some more speed. But it does allow for less non-overlapping channels if you do that. So I would say only do that if you're absolutely sure you're not going to interfere with another access point that may be within close range. So you've got a lot of different options that you can set there for each different function, but this is where you would go through and do these options. We do have a Smart Connect option here as well. Smart Connect simply means that whatever settings you set is going to pair to both bands simultaneously, so you can do that. And they're going to separate the 2.4 and 5 GHz to separate bands so that you can configure them individually if you wish as well. So if you don't want to have 2.4 and 5 to have the exact same SSID, for example, you can split them up here as well if you want to. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to enable and configure the virtual access point group 2, and I'm going to use this one, let's say, for my IoT devices. So I'll go here and I'll put that on the VLAN 20 I created earlier. So I can say here that this is the QHora-1, and I can say put _ IoT if I want to. And you can set different passwords on this if you want to for a different function, and you can choose whether or not this interface is enabled. So I'll tick that and click apply. It will disable the Wi-Fi while it's doing these changes. One of the main reasons I'm doing this setup over an Ethernet connection, just so that I don't lose connection during these changes. Okay, so there we go. We've got the virtual access point group 2 up and running. It's got the different SSID that I've assigned it, and it's now on the VLAN ID of 20. So now the way I've got it configured, anybody connecting to this wireless SSID or anybody connecting through port number 2 on the back of the device, they're all going to be on a VLAN ID of 20 with a separate IP range from everything else. So I can segment those devices off to separate areas if I wish, and you've got options to do that in the NAT and firewall settings. So you can create a rule that anybody on a specific port, specific IP range, you could say prevent them from accessing the LAN IP range on a different interface if you wish. So there's a lot of functions you can do there. So here we've got the firewall rules, so you can enable the firewall, click apply, and what that will do is it will allow you to add different rules. So you can say source any, or you can define a source. So you can choose anybody on VLAN 20, for example, destination to anything outside VLAN 20 you could deny if you wanted to. So there's a lot of functions you can do. You can define set networks as well, so you can say I don't want any of those to ever see google.com, let's say. So you can deny or allow that function. So there's a lot of rules that you can apply here, and you can get creative with whatever you need for that type of setup. So that's the firewall options. The more common used one would be probably the NAT option. So we've got NAT, which is Network Address Translation. So this is how you get multiple machines online through the single IP that your ISP gives you. So you've got a few basic functions here for the application layer gateway. So if you want to have a catch-all to enable, for example, FTP, PPTP, or SIP, SIP would be for things like voice over IP phones, you can enable those here, or you can go into the port forwarding section and add custom rules. So if you wanted to port forward, for example, TCP port 80 for a web server, so you can type in the host IP address that it's going to go to. So I could say, well, I want this to go to 192.168.100.145, let's say, and I'm going to match the port to port 80. I'm going to leave that blank because I want anybody to come from anywhere to be able to access that port rather than restrict it to a certain IP. And I can say this is my web server. So you can apply that rule. So that's now going to allow anybody through the WAN port on port 80, and they're going to be redirected to the LAN IP address of this so that they can gain access to my web server that I have hosted there. We do also have UPNP, so anybody that bought one of the very first QHora devices, this is a function that was added as a firmware update a couple of months after the launch, but it is there as an option. It is off by default just for security, but you can enable this if you want to. By default, you won't be able to select this option, so you must select the WAN interface first to enable the UPnP service. So because you can change the WAN interface around, we haven't made an assumption of where your WAN interface is, so you have to go in and select it. So we've got WAN port 1, we can click OK, and I can come up here and enable UPnP if I wish. I personally don't use it, but if you have a function that needs it, or you're not too sure how to do port forwarding, it's a very good option for you to be able to allow different applications to work correctly. So that's there as an option if you want to use it as well. I'm going to skip the dynamic DNS function at the moment because I've not signed in with my QNAP ID yet, so it will basically give me an error if I click on it. Well, I'll do it and show you. So this is saying you need to bind your QNAP ID with the router to use the My QNAP Cloud DNS function. So I haven't done that yet, so I will add that later and we can show you how this looks a bit later on. So we'll go down to the VPN server. So we do have a QVPN app, which is quite similar to the one we have on our NAS. So this allows you to enable VPN servers depending on the type you want. So we've got QBelt, which is our own application. You've got L2TP, or you've got OpenVPN as an option. And each of them has their own settings. OpenVPN works off configuration files. So once you've set it up and turned it on, there is a download button there so that you can download the configuration file to distribute to the different clients that you might want to connect. But this is how you would configure the VPN server. And once they're set up, you get things like the client list of who's online right now, who's allowed to connect, what their password is, things like that. You can add those users there, and you get logs for the connection. So if anything's happening in there, you can, you need to diagnose a problem. Maybe somebody's trying to authenticate but getting the wrong password. This is where you'd see that. And we also have a VPN client. So right now this supports OpenVPN. So this will allow you to set up different profiles. So you can add in the configuration file. So if you've got two of these QHoras maybe and you want them to talk together without using the QWAN feature, you can do an OpenVPN directly between them as well. You can drop the configuration file, type the data, and you can get it connected. And then you'll be able to enable it once you've added a connection. And again, we've got the connection logs down here as well. So one of the last main sections here is parental controls. So you can set up different things for website filtering, safe searching, filter lists. So first of all, you have to add a role. So you can do things like I want to enable the website filter. You can choose what you're filtering, like Facebook.com, let's say, add it. You can add a bunch of different ones there if you want to. You can turn on safe search features. So let's say for YouTube, you want it to be a restricted search. So you've got two restriction levels to pick from there, medium or restricted. You can do Google and Bing so that you can restrict the results that will come back from those. So that anything sort of mature or violent doesn't come back in those results. So you can apply those functions there as well. So they're added to the list, and then you can add devices that will go under these roles. So for example, add device, it will find the devices you've got, so I can just take my laptop here and add it. So that's now bound to the settings that I've set within that role. Some maintenance functions, we've got some system functions, so different operation modes you can do with the device. So you've got a wireless router mode where everything is enabled, like NAT, DHCP servers, the routing functionality is all on. Or you can choose access point mode. So if we're just being used to extend the Wi-Fi signal of your network and not be used for any routing functionality, you can enable that there, and it disables a lot of those other functions as well. Event logs, so anything that you've done or changed. So most of the settings that I've been doing now, they're all in here. So it shows you all the different settings that we've been enabling. Go down to system settings. This is where you can name your device. So if you want to give it a more logical name instead of sort of the MAC address being there. So I could say change this to Craig QHora if I wanted it to. So QHora. So you can do that and click OK. So that's now my device name. You can reset the unit. So if for whatever reason you need to restart it, you can do that from here. Reset it to factory defaults. Or you can create a backup. So once you've got the config exactly how you want it, you can back up that configuration file so that if you ever did need to restore it again, it's a very quick setup to get it back up and running. And there's also a little beeper in there, so it will do different functions. So it tells you what they're doing. So you can enable or disable that just with the toggle switch. Very easy. And you've also got access controls, so you can bind it with a QNAP ID. You've got the local account that I had created and what they can control. And you've got different access control settings, whether or not you want to enable remote management into this interface or not. For the USB settings, you do have the 2 USB ports on the back of the device. So if you wanted to connect a USB device, so I'll just plug something in there right now. So it's going to allow you to do different functions. So I've just used a 32 gig USB stick, but you can plug that in there. It gives you some information about it, and you can enable the FTP server. So if you want to use it for an FTP server function and choose who's allowed to connect to it, you can have that set up there as well. So you do have a bit of file storage added to the back of the device. One of the last settings there at the bottom is the firmware. So you can do all the firmware updates. So we've got the live update. You can schedule the updates to happen at times that nobody's going to be awake and using the device. That's a bit more convenient. You can set those up. Or of course you can do the manual update and browse for the file that you can get from the link that's right there if you need to get some extra devices, some extra firmwares. So now what I'll do is I'll go through the QuWAN setup. So the QuWAN setup will do a few things, and it will effectively replace the credentials that you use to log into the device with your QNAP ID. So instead of admin and QNAP like I set up at the start, we can log in with our QNAP ID details. So I'm going to click Login with QNAP ID. So it's going to bring me to the login page. So I'm going to write in my QNAP ID email address. We'll type in the password for that, and we'll click Login. It will then want me to confirm the admin account and password for this specific device. So this would be admin and QNAP. So we'll do that there. So now it's replaced my login details, and it wants me to pick a device name. I already changed that, so we'll just leave that one as OK. So now within the QuWAN options, it will allow me to join the organization that I already have set up. So in my example, I do have one already created for QNAP UK, so that's right there. I do already have a region set up as well, so I've got Craig Home Lab, so we'll add it to that. And we can pick the site of QNAP UK. So you can configure the site settings by clicking there, which will take you to our QuWAN Orchestrator, which will give you an overview of how it's all set up. Because this is the first device in the Craig Home Lab region, I must be set as a hub, so I'll choose the hub option. Every other device after that can be an edge device, so they don't have to have a public IP address. And you can set the location as well, because we have some nice mapping functions in there. So we'll click OK, gives you a little warning about what's about to happen, and I'll click OK, and it will now go join me to the QuWAN organization that I've got set up. And I'll give you a little overview of that in a moment. So as that's setting up, we'll pull up the QuWAN Orchestrator information there. Okay, so this is the QuWAN Orchestrator that we've got set up. So we've got the Craig QHora device already been added to the group. It's currently disconnected because it's still trying to do some connections in the background. So it's connected up to the Orchestrator hub. So now what it's doing is a hub-to-hub connection. So what we're trying to get now is that all these other hubs that we've got set up in our office, different locations around the country, we should see that the Craig QHora does get to bind with one of these. So it will pick whichever's the best one based off ping replies, latency, things like that. So we're going to see that it's connected in a moment as well. So we can come back here. So now it says hub-to-hub connected, so the orchestrator should catch up in a moment and show us that it's connected. So maybe if I click off and go back to the different setting and come back again, it should show us that we're connected. And you've also got the topology option here. So in the topology option, you can go through and change different functions. So you can choose who's connected to where, in what region, how are the regions linked to each other, so you can connect between different devices. You get a summary of everything that's there as well. So I think, let's have a look here, scroll to the top. So there we go. We can see that I've got hub-to-hub connections done between all the different devices. So we can see hub-to-hub is connected. The Craig QHora device is connected to both of the QUK hubs that we've got there, so that it can interact, and any clients that I've got hanging off the back of my device or any other hubs that are local to me. So let's say I had a a colleague near me, they would perhaps connect to my hub before they connected through to the others, because that was the quickest route for them. But that's how you would do setup with the QuWAN setup. So you can see all of the different devices there, the status. You can choose who's where. You can move one device to another device. If you don't like the path that was auto detected, you can change that as well. So hopefully that's given you an overview of everything that we've got. So now I've signed the device into my QNAP ID. My DNS functions are there. So I've got the create QHora option. So if I wanted to, I could enable the dynamic DNS for the specific host. So I could pick which WAN interface. So I can say I want the WAN interface, WAN port 1. We can click OK. And that's going to now allow me to enable the dynamic DNS function for the Craig QHora.myqnapcloud.com, so that I can now access remotely into my network with the port forwards, for example, for the web server that I have set up. That's going to allow me to come in and do connections on that as well. So hopefully that's been useful, and you've been able to see the full functionality, the full setup. Obviously, it's quite open to doing a lot of different customization in there. Perhaps a lot of that, especially with the VLANs, might sound a bit advanced to some users. But if you do need the functionality, it is there. By no means do you have to use any of those functions. The only real top tip I would get from the questions I've had so far is people wanting to perhaps change the IP address. And again, that was done within the network and VLAN section. And look for the VLAN at the top that's just got a dash. When you click that little cog, that's where you set the IP address of this device, as well as what IP addresses it's giving out. So that's all done within the very first VLAN that's set up there at the top. Okay, if anybody has any further questions, wants to see anything more, has any suggestions, please do let us know down in the comments section below, and we'll try to cover those off. Okay, thanks a lot for watching, and see you in the next one.